Well, hi everyone, and welcome back to the Engage podcast. It's been a while, hasn't it, Peter?
It has. I've missed doing these with you.
Oh, that's very kind. That's very kind. What have we been doing? Well, why haven't we been doing podcasts? I guess you. I know why. It's not my fault. I've been present, working hard over the month of August. I know traditionally some people like to take August off. Not me. I've taken August at work. I've worked in September. I'm going to be working in October. Where were you?
Well, I was having a marvellous holiday, although I did notice you stopped your schedule of work in October. Didn't you tell me that you were planning on taking almost all of December off?
I did speculate that might be something I looked to try to weave together with my wicked webs. But no, you had a good time. You were interrailing around a lot of Europe, weren't you?
So, yeah, it was a wonderful break.
And you've come back refreshed, rejuvenated,
reinvigorated.
Like
oh gosh, no, that's a lot of words.
That is 3 R words. I'm not even sure I could repeat them if you asked me to.
It could be a sermon.
It could, well, yes, an Anglican sermon. Yes, yeah. The Baptists don't go in for alliteration in the same way.
Do you have more than 3 points as well?
Usually, yes.
Oh, wow.
Sermons traditionally are about between 45 to 50 minutes. I guess we come at it from a very simple vantage point. The longer the sermon, the holier the experience, the person preaching in the congregation.
Where did you get that from God's word?
No, I think you're misunderstanding. Sorry. The Bible leaves us with complete freedom to decide the length of our sermons. We just think our people need quite a lot of teaching.
Do you mean they're less holy to start with? Is that where that ends up?
Do you know, it's great that this podcast has started exactly how every other podcast has started, with some inane tittle-tattle.
Indeed.
But we do want to talk about a number of very significant political developments, because that is what the Engage podcast is really all about.
Absolutely.
We love talking about politics. So as you look at politics right now, what are the big themes that you think we need to be talking about?
Well, I think there are probably 2 particularly big stories currently. The first, and this is probably a good one to begin with, given they are the government, is about how Labour are having a bit of a difficult time, particularly defending themselves over various gifts which they have accepted. That has been a story which has been going for probably more than a week at this point, and it has affected a number of people in the top team. What are some of your instant reactions to the story? Well,
firstly, I think that when these stories run and run and run, one reason why is because if it coincides with a period where Parliament's not sitting and therefore there's not significant legislation that's kind of being introduced or being progressed, then the media are often, particularly political media, they've got nothing else to really write about. And so they do tend to get rather obsessively focused on personalities and the kind of stories around freebies and donations. From a media perspective, this story is the gift that keeps on giving. It's a freebie in that sense. So I think that is one reason why it's run on so much. I also think that it is absolutely striking that so soon after coming into office that the government had become mired in not so much explicit rule breaking, but rather the haze, the impression of something not quite right, something not very fair, maybe the charge of hypocrisy as well. So I've been struck by how quickly it's begun to feel like, hold on, I thought this is what the other lot were like. And now we're relearning perhaps, the lesson that all politicians are basically the same.
Well, I think actually where you landed on that is really significant for this story. I think that is part of the reason why it has had so much legs. It's because Keir Starmer made it such a big thing that the Conservatives were seen to be so corrupt. He went after Boris Johnson over the redecoration of the Downing Street flat, and he went after various other kind of leading members within the Conservative front bench. And so if you're going to paint that narrative that the Conservatives are corrupt and actually we're the good ones and we're going to sort everything out, well, you are absolutely laying yourself open. As soon as there is a whiff of something having gone wrong, it will get thrown back in your face. And that was something I think John Curtis, the pollster, pointed out, is they were setting themselves up for a fall with that line of attack before, because people are then actually really out to get you.
Yes. Can I actually wonder whether, if going back to the election then, so that the framing of things by Starmer and his team, I mean, so obvious why they did that, because it was an easy win.
Yeah.
So, the Tories becoming mired in corruption, particularly Borisgate, Partygate and so on, that was so evident that there was something not quite right. The way he dealt with the Chris Pincher affair, for example, was so badly handled. And he's even admitted that, Boris, in his memoir, which is being serialised in the Daily Mail, of course, because he has a big contract with the Daily Mail. So it was an easy win, but I love that point. They set themselves up, because if you set a really high standard, you inevitably are going to fall short of that high standard. I'm just surprised by how quickly it's happened. That's all.
And it is actually quite an interesting one for us to think about as Christians, isn't it? Because we do believe in calling leaders to a high standard.
Yes.
So it's not that that's something we don't want to see happen, but there's almost a danger in terms of the opposition being the ones to do it in case it gets thrown back upon themselves. So I don't actually know what the solution is to something like that.
No, and actually, I think that, again, this is primarily a perception problem rather than a kind of an actual explicit rule-breaking problem.
Yeah.
Let's just rehearse perhaps just some of the details. And here I'm falling back on my my show notes. That's what they're called. That's the technical term, Peter. Forgive me. While you were away, I've really professionalised. So this is what's happened. You have, first of all, there was this massive story because Sir Keir Starmer's chief advisor, Sue Gray, ended up being paid more than him.
Yes.
So the prime ministerial salary, I believe, is approximately, I think, 160,000.
167, I think.
167,000. Inflation has helped. But her salary, I think, is 170,000. So, I mean, it is only $3,000 more. But I've heard some people say that the senior advisor must never be paid more than the principal. That's just the principle that's been broken here.
And again, there are a lot of people out to get Sue Gray. So for anyone who has forgotten, Sue Gray was the civil servant who ultimately ended up producing the report over the Partygate scandal.
Yes.
I think it was initially due to be Simon Case, and then he had to recuse himself because he was implicated in the scandal himself.
He attended the party.
Indeed.
Yeah. Well, allegedly.
So Sue Gray ended up doing this report. I remember her name being thrown about by Boris Johnson in Prime Minister's questions over and over again. Wait for the Sue Gray report.
It became this kind of mantra that he just kind of went to again and again.
So it's sort of, to paraphrase you, it was like it was one of the Gospels.
That's right. Yeah, how'd that work for you, Boris?
So there are a lot of people out to get Sue Gray because the report was seen to sort of throw Boris under the bus.
Yeah.
And then Keir Starmer appointed her basically to be his senior advisor. And so it was sort of saying, well, a civil servant is supposed to be neutral, and she's gone to be like the chief advisor to the leader of the Labour Party. That doesn't seem very fair.
It's like a Jedi falling to the dark side, becoming a Sith Lord.
Quite just like that.
You weren't expecting that, were you?
I wasn't expecting that.
To be honest, I wasn't either.
Have you seen Star Wars? I've never seen Star Wars.
Hold on. Oh, okay. I don't know what to do with that information. How can you sit there and calmly tell me you've never seen Star Wars? Isaac, have you seen Star Wars? Yeah, our producer's nodding. Okay, you, my friend, you need to watch Star Wars. Not the three most recent ones. You can start with number 4. Which was made in do start there and watch and please enjoy it because. Okay, you're going to have to talk.
I feel like I've really thrown our rhythm we were in there.
But back to Sue Gray. Yes. Sorry, that Star Wars reference was lost on you, wasn't it?
Don't worry. I do vaguely know what happened.
Would a Harry Potter reference help? Would that be better? No, a Narnia reference. A Narnia.
Well, there you go.
There we go. It's like she became this kind of like white witch figure,
Perfect.
Thank goodness.
Now you're speaking my language.
There we go.
Yes, so Sue Gray ended up being seen as... Well, effectively, how can a civil servant end up advising Keir Starmer?
Yeah.
And then there's been a lot of stuff also about her managerial style.
Yeah.
And so various people not very happy, but she's sort of come in from the outside and she seems to be kind of controlling who has access. So there's a lot of people who are looking to sort of see her taken down a peg or two.
Totally agree. I do kind of think they need to get over themselves. I mean, it is a smart move of the man who's hoping to become Prime Minister to appoint a very senior civil servant to the position of Chief of Staff.
Absolutely.
Who will effectively be the most important figure underneath him in government because she knows how government works. And Starmer made this big thing about wanting to set up these mission boards, this restructuring of Whitehall, which, by the way, every proponent, every person who wants to be Prime Minister always says they're going to restructure Whitehall. Time will tell whether this is effective. But someone who knows how the system works, that is completely sensible strategically as a tactic. It works. So I do think these people who've had a big problem with her, it says more about them than it does about her.
In theory, I think you're bang on with that. I think the difficulty with this one was she was already a public figure who was seen to have played a part in Boris Johnson's
Yes,
demise.
that's fair. That's completely fair.
And so that's ended up, I think, being potentially a slightly naive misstep from Keir Starmer, sort of not realising how that would be perceived by certain swathes within the public who are still of the view that Boris Johnson can do no wrong and it's all a conspiracy and a stitch-up.
And then this comes back to the fact that Labour have come in with a massive majority, which gives the impression that a huge number of voters out there have voted for Labour enthusiastically. Well, I don't doubt that some people voted for Labour enthusiastically. They're hardcore.
But by the law of averages, yes.
All right, I'm sure Victoria, Keir Starmer's wife, voted enthusiastically for Labour at the ballot box.
Indeed.
However, I think that their electoral coalition is pretty shaky because most people have gone, we're willing to give you a go, but we will reserve judgment. And my goodness, if you let us down, we will come for you at the next election.
I think that's right. And I think that has been seen, and I know we will come on to this in a little bit more detail in a moment, that has been seen in the absolute plummeting in Keir Starmer's personal approval ratings, where he is now, I think, got a lower approval rating than Rishi Sunak had when he called the election.
Yes.
So I would absolutely agree with that. People were not necessarily enthusiastic about the prospect of Labour. They were enthusiastic about the prospect of getting rid of the Conservatives.
That's right. And that's why the change narrative was so effective. But of course, one of the things that I think they didn't manage to do was really clearly define, what do you mean by change?
Yeah.
And that was very interesting at the Labour Party conference that we've just had. I felt like there was lots of the repeating of the usual kind of lines. There was a little bit of the doomsday stuff. Then there was an attempt to try to be a bit more uplifting. And also there was that real sense here that we're going to keep repeating the change thing. We're going to try to sell the things we've already done, like setting up of Great British Energy, for example, and some of the pieces of legislation they've introduced. But there wasn't really any new policy announcements. So you still are left with this question of, you said change begins. You keep saying that, but then we read, for example, that you've been taking donations so that you can wear some new clothes.
Yes, indeed. Or indeed going to a Taylor Swift concert.
Yeah, so let's just run through this. This was the moment I've been building up to be honest with you. I was just waiting. Loved what you've said, but this is the moment. This is it, everyone. Here we go. So Sir Keir Starmer and other senior Labour figures, they've been criticised for accepting gifts, including clothing, from the Labour donor Lord Wahid Ali. Now, Lord Ali gave clothes, for example, to the Prime Minister and his wife. And he was also given a temporary Downing Street pass, though that is no longer the case. It's not been disclosed exactly what he did in Downing Street. Starmer apparently has a new pair of glasses worth £2,500. I'd just like to point out that my glasses just here are also new. Thank you very much. I got a buy one, get the other half price, and they cost me the grand total of around £150 for both pairs. They're not designer, but hey, they work. So Starmer had glasses worth £2,500. How much are your glasses worth, Isaac?
Somewhere in that region.
Somewhere in that region. What, 2,500? I'm not surprised, to be honest. Ali has given £700,000 of his £200 million fortune to Labour, apparently. He's let Angela Rayner stay in his New York home, and he gave her £2,230 for clothes. Starmer has received £39,000 since December 2019, which is, I mean, for some people, they don't get paid that in 2 years of hard work. He's received 4 Taylor Swift tickets worth £4,000 and £35,000 worth of tickets to Arsenal football matches. And then the story developed again because in 2021, he used a flat that's owned by Lord Ali and he dressed it up to look like it was his own home, even though it wasn't. Now, I must say, I don't think that is the worst crime that Starmer has committed.
No, not at all.
But when you put it all together, you get this sense of, hold on, here is someone who has received an enormous amount of money, many, many gifts completely for free. Lord Ali, by the way, has made it very clear that he gave all of this without any expectation of anything in return. And my issue with that is I I don't question perhaps his motive there, in the sense of, I'm sure when he gave it, he didn't add strings to it necessarily. My point is that if you give that much money to a political party, you will get something back. That's just how it works. It's also naive. This idea, I gave and I didn't expect anything back. I just think that is either that's misleading the public or that is very, very naive. And I base that on just how the human heart works. Jeremiah says, the heart is deceitful above all things. So you might want to believe that you didn't put strings on that. But if you give that much money to the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Chancellor, and just the party of government, and you get a pass, for example, well, that is you receiving something in return. I doubt he would have received a pass if he'd not given nearly £700,000 to Labour. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do agree with all of that. I also agree with your point before that these things are comparatively trivial within the big picture. And I've seen various kind of comments saying, well, actually, shouldn't the Prime Minister have some sort of allowance for having clothes, for instance? And I don't necessarily disagree with those things either. I guess it is primarily a perception point, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. At the same time as they've cut the winter fuel allowance.
Exactly, it's not a good look.
Struggling pensioners, it's not a good look, no.
Yes, or similarly kind of various other tax rates.
So how do I process this as a Christian voter? As someone who, for example, has lent my vote to different parties, and a point I keep stressing on this podcast. I don't know why, but I must be atoning for the sin of working for one particular party.
Which
briefly.
party was
No,
that,
I don't
James?
think that's important, Peter. I think we should move on. Have you seen Star Wars? But I think, how can I process this? What am I supposed to do with this? Because on the one hand, I know full well what the standard is. That God's word is absolutely clear that we're to be honest, that we're not to lie, that we're not to deceive. So there in the 10 Commandments, you shall not lie, for example. You can't mislead. And you want your leaders to have character and you want them to have integrity, but technically no laws, as far as we're aware, have been broken. And also I'm a little bit nervous about how can I hold non-Christians? I mean, I don't think any of these key players would publicly say they were followers of Jesus. How do I hold the difference between the standard God requires of a Christian politician and a non-Christian politician? Is that the same standard, for example?
Gosh, there's a lot of
there's a lot of questions, but I'm just fascinated. How can I process this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is completely fair to say that hypocrisy is wrong, and it is up to others to judge whether this meets that threshold or not. But I don't think that's a controversial point. If you're going to criticise another party for doing something, you need to make sure that you're not doing it yourself. I think there is also a point for us to actually kind of take a moment to think, is what the media is saying about this fair or not?
Yeah.
And to actually examine our own hearts and our own motivations. Are we desperate to see a party be brought down?
That's right.
And I think that's a real temptation when you've had what was probably a fairly triumphalist moment for Labour a couple of months ago. And I think they're actually still thinking that they are the most popular thing since sliced bread, which is out of step with public opinion.
And it could be hubris, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I think we need to kind of actually check ourselves and say, look, rather than me wanting to just buy into a narrative, why don't I actually do my research and see how does this compare with what the Conservatives actually did accept? Is this criticism fair, or is it a media storm? What actually is the truth in this circumstance? Have, for instance, Labour not declared their gifts? Well, as far as I can see, in the vast majority of cases, they have followed the rules on that kind of thing.
Yes.
So I do think there is a point for us in there in looking to be people of truth.
I think that's right. And I also think that, generally speaking, I think we should be quick to want to believe the best in people, not to jump to, they just must be terrible people with terrible motives, and you kind of end up just dismissing them all. I think, for example, Sir Keir Starmer said that some of the actions he's taken was to protect his family, and in particular to help his son who was doing his GCSEs. I think that my response should be one of saying, well, fair enough. That's you trying to be a good dad. And we must never, ever forget that alongside being Prime Minister, he is still a dad. He is still a husband. And so even if I disagree with the outcome of his decision and the decision itself. I think you have to be very careful before reading into that some kind of terrible motive. You have to be careful about judging the heart, because the Bible says that, we can't judge the heart. God alone can judge the heart. At the same time, the Bible also says, by their fruits you shall know them. And so we do have this kind of value judgment that we probably will end up having to make around the integrity of Keir Starmer. And I liked your point about questioning the media narrative as well, because you see some wild stuff coming out in the media. Mainstream media, some of it is great and actually can help us know and understand things that we otherwise wouldn't know. It reveals information to us. But every media outlet does have an agenda that they're trying to promote, that they're trying to push. And it's worth us being aware of that, so we don't read and engage with the mainstream media uncritically.
Yeah,
and Romans 13, be subject to the governing authority. So is my reaction to £2,500 worth of glasses going to mean that I'm likely to wrongly disobey the command that I'm given to have a right submission to government, with all the caveats of, if they ask me to do something that goes against God's word? But the attitude, I think, is more what I'm kind of wrestling with around it. It'd be so easy to join the bandwagon on this, because it's easy. You just take pot shots at these people. Oh, they're in power. Look at them. They're terrible. They accept all this money. Aren't they awful? Yeah. Well, yes, I liked your point, dig into the truth, but also be careful about my own heart in terms of how quick I can be just to judge these people. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Yeah. What has been some of your other observations? Now we are, 2 months in? Almost 3 months in since election day. How do you think it's all going?
Well, I think that they're realising how difficult government is. I think that they are struggling to get the balance right between the doomsday black hole in the public finances and then also give people a bit of hope. You can play the doomsday card for so long, but I think people increasingly want to hear something that's a bit more optimistic. And they're struggling to pivot away from £22 billion black hole in the public finances. Things are going to get worse before they get better. Things will get better. They will. I think that's just a hard transition from a kind of messaging point of view. I think the other thing is Labour are benefiting at the moment from the fact that we don't yet have the newly crowned leader of the Conservative Party.
Interesting. I'm going to push back on that.
Oh, no, do, yeah.
Because I think actually, I think part of the reason why Labour's ratings are plummeting so much is because people can't actually see an alternative currently to contrast them with.
Interesting.
If you were to have a regular opposition, you would have a kind of X versus Y.
Yes.
So you've got either Labour or Conservatives. I think because it's a bit like when, if you're supporting a football team and one of your players is injured, they seem to be the answer to all the problems when they're out of the team,
which is unrealistic.
I always wonder if there's a little bit of that going on where things have not gone brilliantly for Labour in these first couple of months. Obviously, we had the absolute disaster of the riots up and down the country, which was a horrible situation. People were pretty divided, I think, on Labour's response to that. I completely do agree with you on the whole doomsday narrative thing. People want to hear a positive vision rather than just feeling depressed all the time, which is one of the big differences with Blair, actually, because I think in 97, you did have this sense of things are going to get better, and here they're saying, well, it's going to potentially get worse first.
When Blair came in, there wasn't at that time, if memory serves me right, because I was alive, I was only
how old were you?
4 or 5, I don't know. So I don't have a vivid memory of it. But as someone who was living then, as far as I remember from my history, there wasn't massive conflicts happening in the Middle East at the time. There wasn't a war in Ukraine. There wasn't all of the global instability. So that's clearly a factor as well. It's striking to me how quickly Starmer seems to find far more joy in the job on the international stage than domestically. And this has always been a thing for prime ministers, that they tend to find very quickly that the international side of going to the G7 and going to the Munich Security Conference and meeting world leaders actually is a much more energizing and exciting part of the job. And you kind of leave the domestic front for a season and then you come back and it's just all of the sludge of Sue Gray said said this, and Morgan McSweeney said this, and by the way, Angela Rayner, don't trust her, and it's all this stuff that they are just like, they almost want to rise above it because at international stage you're mixing with this outgoing American President Joe Biden. You're talking about a peace plan for the Middle East and how is the war in Ukraine going to end, and that just feels more worthy of your time, I think. So I do think it's interesting that listening to some other podcasts, not that any other podcast really exists apart from this one, but listening to some other podcasts, then I really do sense that Starmer has quickly fallen into that mode of international stage is more comfortable for him because it takes him away from just the sheer. I mean, he must be absolutely fuming about all of this. This must be so frustrating for him.
Yeah, no, massively so. And yeah, the popularity ratings are really damaging, I think. You would surely think you've just got this massive majority, one of the largest majorities in British political history. You think you're kind of settled for at least a kind of good 2 or 3 years. You're going to have a honeymoon period, and actually the whole thing has gone within 3 months.
Well, I mean, maybe two thoughts. Maybe there's an element here of 1 Peter 5 quoting from Proverbs 11:31. God opposes the proud but shows favor to the humble. And I've always thought that's a principle that you find just right the way through the Bible. And so if you come into power on the back of a big majority, you are going to be tempted to be quite proud. And I do think that maybe there's a spiritual dynamic to all of this, which is God opposes the proud. So he is involved. Like, he will not necessarily just remove leaders and bring leaders down in that way, but I think sometimes leaders can struggle because they are filled with that pride, and it is a hubris thing. And of course they've got these unrealistic expectations attached to them, and they can't possibly hope to meet them. I think Blair suffered from that in some ways. Whereas I think the other thing I would say is I do wonder whether today people, as in the voters, also have unrealistic expectations from their government and from their leaders.
I completely agree with that. I think as a people, we want to have good public services, but we also want to have less money paid in taxes. We cannot have both.
Yes.
We envision having an NHS which runs brilliantly, but also we can't actually find the funding for it. And actually we want to have kind of social care all sorted out, but actually we can't find funding.
And on the NHS, even a whiff of privatisation and we lose our minds.
Yeah.
But even though that might be part of the solution to keeping it free at the point of use.
Completely. Or similarly on the environment.
Yes.
Actually we're pro net zero, but we also don't want to kind of damage British businesses. We cannot have all of these things.
Surely this is just cakeism. This is the Boris Johnson cakeism strategy of you can have your cake and you can eat it, except the 3 years of Boris Johnson showed us you can't have your cake and you can't eat it.
No, and if you do eat it, then you'll actually be fined.
Yes. Very good. Yeah, that's very funny. Yeah, that's right. Yes.
As we start sort of pivoting then to the Tories, with the mention of Boris Johnson.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Where are we at now? We're still
going
only
on.
just halfway through a leadership contest.
5 weeks to go. Rishi Sunak, in his final speech at Conservative Party conference, which is ongoing at the moment, and he spoke unusually as the outgoing leader on the first day. Normally the leader gives the big speech at the end, but he's leaving lots of room for the 4 remaining contestants. So Mel Stride and Priti Patel have dropped out.
Indeed.
And remaining in the contest is number 1, Robert Jenrick. That's not number 1, by the way, in preference of who I'm voting for. I couldn't vote anyway. I'm not a member.
No, neither am I.
Very good. So politically neutral. Robert Jenrick, number 1. Number 2, Kemi Badenoch. Number 3, James Cleverly. And number 4, Tom Tugendhat. Question, Peter, who would you vote for?
I was going to ask you that later.
I got in there first.
Why don't we talk about what they all believe in, and then we can actually give an informed answer.
So Jenrick is absolutely obsessed with immigration. It's immigration. That's all he talks about.
I like the dramatic pause for effect. Do you remember when we actually walked past him, like the day after he resigned from the cabinet?
And he was getting photos taken, and he was like, "Is that all right, guys?" And I just thought, "Wow, what a life!" You come out your front door, and there's a photographer ready to snap you. And he was very. In fact, he got in. I was having a drink outside the Red Lion pub, which is quite a famous pub. I can't tell if that look is sort of like, you're having a drink in a pub. And I do socialise, Peter. Anyway, Robert Jenrick got into a car right outside where we were standing. So my friend was very excited by that, more so than me, it must be said. But Robert Jenrick, it's all about immigration. That's his big thing.
And his political evolution has been quite interesting, hasn't it? Because he was a One Nation Tory.
Seen to be. Yeah.
And then a couple of years back, he made his sudden pivot.
Yes, resigned from Rishi Sunak's government. Well, technically it was His Majesty's government, but under Rishi Sunak, he was put in the Home Office to keep an eye on Suella Braverman, so they said. And then he resigned because he felt Rishi Sunak wasn't following through in terms of actually dealing with the high level of migration and illegal migration into our country.
And it is interesting now, sort of following his, I guess, quite well-planned campaign. He is really throwing some red meat to the Reform voters, isn't he? So it's sort of all like, we've got to leave the ECHR.
European Convention on Human Rights.
I almost got that wrong way round.
You did brilliantly.
So it's all about leaving the ECHR. But even some of the kind of things like, he was photographed on his run wearing like a T-shirt saying Hamas are terrorists.
Yes, that's
Something
right,
well, who owns a T-shirt saying Hamas are terrorists, which like normally, like she thought it was the kind of thing you would only put on just so you could be photographed on your run.
But and I think if he was honest enough, he would admit that. But he also, by the way, has changed his mind in a good way on assisted suicide. So he now will vote against assisted suicide.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he also has a relatively good voting record when it comes to things like gender reform, for example, and also has spoken relatively sensibly about the danger of overreach when it comes to things like conversion therapy and conversion practices legislation. So this is what I find interesting. If you're a Christian and you're a Tory party member, that might tip things a little bit. But then at the same time, you probably find some of his rhetoric around immigration pretty troubling.
Yeah, absolutely. So we would surely have to say he is the most right-wing currently of the four. He wants a stronger version of the Rwanda plan again, doesn't he?
Yes, exactly. Yes. And interestingly, James Cleverly, one of his policy commitments is to resurrect the Rwanda scheme, which I think is fascinating because as far as I'm aware, I don't know if Tom Tugendhat has gone that far, and I don't think Kemi Badenoch has necessarily gone that far either. And she certainly hasn't gone as far as saying definitely leaving the European Convention on Human Rights.
No, but both Badenoch and Tugendhat have sort of said do it as a last resort.
Absolutely. So they're open to it, but they're kind of keeping their options open.
Yeah, and actually we should sort of touch briefly on the Rwanda scheme.
Yes.
Because not something I think which we've focused on in depth before. I'm not suggesting we have a long conversation about it now. But it's obviously one which provokes quite extreme reactions, isn't it?
Yes.
So on the one hand, lots of people would feel like it was a pretty heartless policy. Many people who are asylum seekers ultimately have actually been trafficked, and so that has been, from a care perspective, that has always been our concern with the Rwanda scheme. Was, well, aren't you just going to be deporting vulnerable people who have actually been trafficked into the UK? So there's certainly that angle on it. The flip side of that is I think I read a story the other week saying Germany was considering sort of processing immigrants in a third country. I can't remember which country. It might have been Romania or Albania.
Okay.
So it's not like other countries aren't actually considering similar schemes now.
And some would argue that there's a big difference between Albania, for example, or Romania and Rwanda.
Yeah.
You can debate that if you want. I think also that from a Christian point of view, I can understand the desire to control migration.
Yeah.
I think the principle of fairness is important. I think if we simply had an open border policy, we don't necessarily, for lots of reasons, and you can debate whether these are good reasons or bad, but we don't necessarily actually have the ability and capacity as a country to care for them all properly and look after them properly. So I can understand you'd want to say that there must be rules, there must be fairness. at the same time, the question I suppose at the heart of this from a Christian perspective is, does something like a Rwanda scheme or a hostile borders policy, does that affirm or does it undermine the God-given dignity that every single one of those asylum seekers and those illegal immigrants, and this is the thing, in the Christian worldview, there's no difference in value and dignity for the illegal immigrant as with this person who's applied through legitimate means. So that's the tension, isn't it? And Christians have very strong views, and then I think most brothers and sisters, they're probably somewhere in the middle of I'm not quite sure what to do with this.
Completely. And I think, again, this shows a problem we sort of alluded to earlier, but it's much easier to identify problems than it is solutions.
Yes.
Because there is a general consensus among the British public that the immigration numbers should be lowered.
Yeah.
What people can't seem to agree is how we
do that. I mean, if I think about the social care and my interaction with the social care sector, I think the vast majority of carers that my dad had came from overseas. And I'm grateful for every single one of them for the fact that through their hard work, they gave my dad dignity. And in doing so, they were also living out as image bearers of God himself. So it becomes very personal as well. Whereas I think part of the challenge for policymakers always is it's their job to step back from the personal and to try to look at things as objectively as possible. And when you do that, I think you can't get away from the incredibly high levels of migration that we've had and all the pressure that puts on public services. At the same time, a lot of our workforce, particularly the National Health Service, the gaps are being plugged by people joining our country from overseas. So but
I guess there are no simple solutions to some of these things, are there? And so we might be quite clear on what we wouldn't want as a solution, but it is also incumbent upon us to think of a positive solution as well, rather than just kind of criticising different ideas.
Absolutely. And I do wonder if this is helping us engage with, okay, if you're a Christian and you have a vote in the Tory leadership contest, or you're a Christian and you care very much that about the contest and you have an interest in it, I think that one of the things you want to be looking for is, out of the 4 candidates, which is the one who doesn't talk as if there are lots of easy solutions to these problems? Which is the one who's honest enough to say, this will not be easy, there is no good answer, we need to grapple with and wrestle with these principles and try to work them through before coming to some kind of policy offer? Because I think that I would apply this more generally, actually, for anyone in politics, that's got to be a good thing when you're honest enough and able to say, I'm not going to be pressed into offering some kind of gimmick as a solution, or the impression that, if we just leave the ECHR, it'll all be sorted. The European Convention on Human Rights has been used positively to uphold Christian freedoms in this country. Many legal cases over the last sort of 15, 20 years that other organizations have led on with Christian clients, they've ultimately resorted to reliance on the articles of that convention. And that has been effective at times. So we would lose that if we left the ECHR.
Yeah. Well, we started with Jenrick.
Yes.
Why don't we go on to Kemi next?
Yes. Are all cultures equal?
So that is for anyone who doesn't know, that's a reference to a piece which Kemi Badenoch wrote in The Telegraph last weekend. She said she wrote in that piece that not all cultures are equal. That was in particular relation to immigration again. So sort of thinking, well, actually, do we want people who are migrating from all different parts of the world when actually in some parts of the world they believe in child marriage, and is someone going to just leave those beliefs at the door? I thought this was a really interesting comment because I'm going to be controversial. I agree with her. And actually, I don't think we do ourselves any favours if we pretend that all cultural values are equal.
Oh, totally. I mean, either again, from a Christian perspective, I think you can say very confidently that any culture that doesn't treat women equally is wholly incompatible with the Christian worldview and therefore is morally inferior to our culture. And I also think she articulated relatively well that there are such things as Western values, democracy, freedom, equality, and that these things matter and that other cultures do not have these things.
Completely. And I've seen some critiques of it, which I've actually thought have been far too simplistic, sort of saying, well, yes, okay, this culture has its blind spot, but our culture also has its blind spot as well. I mean, no one is saying that actually, like 21st century Britain has got everything right. But I think it is legitimate to say that I would prefer personally to live in Britain than I would in some other places around the world. I don't think that's actually a controversial thing to say, or even to sort of say actually that some blind spots are bigger than others.
Yes.
So the idea that not all cultures are equal, I've got to say, I ultimately thought Kemi was kind of fair enough to say it.
I think so. I think the challenge that she will have is the media will hound her for this, as they have been. I mean, she was on Laura Kuenssberg on Sunday, and the entire interview was taken up basically with questions about this, about culture. I also think that for her, you then have to defend and explain where Western values ultimately come from. And you then get into a discussion about British values. And when that happened before, it was a complete dog's dinner because, well, what do you mean British values? We don't enshrine them in a constitution. So they're actually very difficult to define.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. It's interesting the whole point around the media kind of really going after her on it. Because in a sense, I actually don't think she minds.
No,
I think this is
probably
part
not.
of Kemi's strategy, isn't it?
Yes.
She likes to be the candidate who says things which cut through, and she likes to cause controversy and make the headlines, which on one level probably makes her quite a good campaigner. Whether that makes her a good leader is a different question, because leadership is not defined by how much airtime you get in public.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I think the challenge for her as well is there are these rumours about her being quite combative, and including towards civil servants, and that never plays well. And if she does, if there's any credence to that, and she has denied it, there's any credence to that, if she does ever get into number 10, it will cause problems for her and for the government that she leads. So time will tell whether the Kemi strategy will pay off. But I think at the moment, I would say it's probably going to be her and Robert in the final two that then goes to the members. That's what I think, because the other two, James Cleverly and Tom Tugendhat, I mean, very sincere, working hard, no doubt, but they don't seem to have quite the cut through that Jenrick and Badenoch have.
Yes, which potentially the two of them would see as a vindication of their strategy, wouldn't they?
Yes.
So I think in the latest round, so as a reminder to people, the way this works is, first of all, MPs have a number of rounds knocking people out as they go.
Yep.
And then the final two go to the Conservative members to vote on. I think in the latest round, Tugendhat and Cleverly both had 21 backers each. Kemi had 28. Jenrick had, I want to say, 33 or 34.
Yeah.
So they're that little bit behind. Of course, you've lost Mel Stride now, so his 16 votes can go somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so there's probably an element of going after those 16 votes, but also kind of looking to try and take votes off one another. Cleverly and Tugendhat certainly are that little bit behind. I think Cleverly's big pitch is that he's experienced. He has been Home Secretary, he's been Foreign Secretary. So he is the only one of the four who has been in
one of the big jobs.
One of the
in fact, two of the big jobs.
Indeed, two of the big offices of state. So he can kind of present himself as that steady pair of hands. Tugendhat is quite different, isn't he? So he would be seen as more from the softer centre of the party.
Yep.
It was interesting. I was listening to him being interviewed today. He was asked a question about what his views are on, say, abortion and assisted suicide, and he did kind of openly say that he was from a Catholic background, and therefore that certainly plays a part in his own moral decisions, although not necessarily looking to impose that upon others. He did say he would find it very, very difficult to ever back assisted suicide, which I found quite encouraging.
He has, I think, a relatively good voting record on euthanasia and assisted suicide. But it's fascinating. And I think now, for the membership, it is quite something, isn't it? That potentially the next Prime Minister of our country will ultimately be decided by something like 0.something% of the UK population. But I also always think that's a very, very cheap shot, because that's just how politics works.
It is. And that is, I guess, under the assumption the Conservatives win the next election, which is a very optimistic prediction, given where they're coming from.
That's not my prediction at all. I'm saying that in this hypothetical environment where that might happen. But yes, I think I'm going to say Jenrick and Badenoch, and I think the way they should decide it is both should go and Strictly Come Dancing, do one dance each, get scored, and then the public vote, and whoever wins that should be the next leader.
Go on,
of His
who
Majesty's
would you
opposition.
vote for? If out of those four, who would you actually?
Someone who I will not name, told me that they really did not like Kemi Badenoch. And I said, well, why do you not like Kemi Badenoch? And they said, oh, she's one of these militant females, which I thought was
my word,
quite a phrase.
Gosh, I was not expecting you to say that.
I know.
Gosh, that is a phrase.
That is a phrase, yeah. I'm just not quite sure that I buy her whole thing. My concern is that she's not as good as she presents, and she wouldn't actually be able to follow through. And therefore, I'm a little bit nervous about her. I think that there is something to be said for Cleverly and Tugendhat's kind of broader appeal. I think the fact that they're talking beyond just immigration. So I think if I was really, really pushed, I might be tempted by someone like Tom or James Cleverly. What about you?
If it were me, which it is not, Tom Tugendhat would be my favourite.
There we go.
But I don't think he's going to get to the final two anyway.
No.
Go on. If it were Jenrick or Kemi, which is what we actually think, well, we can both say it on the count of three who we'd go for.
Okay.
Okay. 1, 2, 3.
Kemi.
There we go.
Okay, it's so depressing.
We should also say Care does not support any one particular candidate. This is only representative of our own personal views. That is where we both came down.
And it's also completely hypothetical.
It is,
I will not be voting in the Conservative Party.
Neither will I.
Okay, we have talked about Labour, we've talked about the Conservatives, and we find ourselves in this position where hopefully by the time we next record on the podcast, we will know who the final two are, and we can then talk in even greater detail about their policy platforms. As coming at it as a Christian, in terms of the position of leader of the opposition, what's got to be the great hope here?
Oh gosh. Well, I think probably the same as our hope in any leader of a political party. I think we want the person in charge to be a person who is a person of truth and integrity. I think we want good character. I think we want competence, and we want kind of convictions which actually are at least not opposed to a Christian worldview. So I would probably go with those 3 C's. There we go. Good Anglican again.
Very good. Oh, it's all coming out now. Yes. Yes. Can you repeat them?
I can. Character.
Yes.
Competence.
Yes.
Conviction.
Conviction.
There we go.
Very good. Character, competence, conviction. And on that note, I think it's time we drew stumps.
A very good cricketing analogy for the end of the season.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah, that's sad, isn't it? When's the next test?
Pakistan.
Yes, very soon, actually. Hopefully
coming
Stokes
up
will be
next
fit.
week, I think.
Yeah, Ben Stokes back at the helm. That'd be good, because the Ollie Pope thing was fun, but Ben Stokes is the real deal, isn't he? So,
yeah. I wouldn't have said it was that fun.
Yeah,
Hashtag bowled out.
Bring back Jimmy Anderson. But that's just me. Anyway, it's been fantastic, Peter. A pleasure as always. And we hope to be back very, very soon with the next episode of the Engage podcast. As ever, if you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a review. The higher the review, we're more interested. The lower the review, don't bother. You can also get in contact with us as well. Just follow us on our social media channels at CareOrgUK. Subscribe on our YouTube channel, and we'll be back very soon with the next Engage podcast. Peter, until then, goodbye.
Good to see you.